Anyway, there we go. I think we got 2 channels up again. There we go. Yeah. All right, we're back live in living stereo. Let's try this. Let's do this all over again, and we'll do it from the top.
Welcome to another dimension, a dimension of insight, a dimension of understanding. You are entering a place where reality collides with truth. There are no limits, there are no boundaries. This is Offplanet Radio.
There we go. We got it right that time. That's called take 2. You're not supposed to do that on live radio, but what the hell, we do it anyway. Living live in color and beautiful stereo. I'm Randy Maugans, offplanetradio.com. The live show after a 2-week break. I'd like to say I was more rested. Vacations are stressful. And I think I went through a dark night of the soul experience. I spent a lot of time ruminating over a lot of things, and this space of paranormal, conspiracy, UFO, all the things we cover, we got to be really careful. There are operators out there, and I kind of went through this revelation that there are people out there who are disinfo agents and people out there who don't know what the hell they're talking about, and it gets worse from there. That's not true with my guest tonight, though. First segment tonight, 90 minutes, returning after too long a time, October 2010, the last time we spoke with him. He's back. He is probably one of the biggest footprints in paranormal, conspiracy, ufology, alternative media press. Nick Redfern is on the line with me, and we're going to bring him in right now. Hey, Nick, how you doing?
Hey, Randy. I'm doing good, thanks. How's things?
It's good to hear your voice on the other end there. At least that channel worked. We had a misfire, and we don't like that here. So anyway, catching up with you, it's been a couple of years since you and I last talked. In fact, I think the show got renamed since then. It used to be called Exotica. And in that show, we had a big discussion about the Collins Elite Final Events, the book that you had out at that time. Yeah. And of course, that's a few pages down the road from where we are now. Your the title that jumped out into my head most prominently was your recent book, The Real Men in Black, and you now have a new title that's coming to press this very week, The World's Weirdest Places. And you are in Texas. You're in San Antonio, is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I actually live in the Dallas area, but I'm doing a series of week of lectures. Started in just north of Dallas, and then San Antonio last night, and then Austin on Saturday. So, and I've got a day or two in between. So, sort of up and down Texas for 7 days, if you like.
You're a busy guy. You do a lot of legwork. A lot of people don't realize that you do your own field investigations. You do a massive amount of research. You're not just sitting in a room writing books, are you, Nick?
No, I mean, that's certainly a significant part of it. I mean, when you get down to the writing of the book, you've got to crank the thing out, and it's not, as some people think, every day is full of excitement. You get up, and I sort of, when I do the writing, I treat it as a job. I try and do Monday to Friday, 8 to 5, so I can have a normal social life afterwards, and switch off and watch the English soccer at night, and go down the pub with my mates at the weekend or whatever, and just have a normal life. But when I'm writing the books in the day, I sort of start 8 to 5 Monday to Friday and just crank out writing non-stop. But when I'm doing the research, I've always been of the opinion that if you're going to write a book, don't kind of shortchange the reader, because, as well as being an author, I like to read books as well. I have my favorite authors, and you don't want to pick up a book and find it's just rehashed stuff from, 20 or 30 other books. You want to see that the author's actually done something of their own making, not just because, you know, you feel better in that sense, but also because you want to see if they've been able to add something new to it. And that's what I always do. So, you know, if I was going to write, say, a book on Mothman, not that I have any plans to, but if I was going to, you know, I wouldn't just get a hold of all the different books that have been published on Mothman. You know, I'd go out to Point Pleasant, West Virginia, where all the sightings occurred, and interview as many of the people as I could, go out to the areas and see what I could pick up that was new, and can we take the story further. So those are the sort of things I look for when I'm writing, you know, that you can add something new to a controversy, or hopefully even better, a new story, but validate it for yourself as well, you know. So. I'm actually surprised that you haven't written about Mothman, because, like I said, you leave a big footprint on this whole paranormal realm. Well, I guess the reason I haven't, really, is because it's kind of like there's been so much good stuff written, like John Keel's book, you know, it's kind of like, how could you top the Mothman prophecy, you know? There's sort of some books that for me are sort of, it's kind of like my favourite bands, you know, it's kind of like, why would somebody try and copy them when that album or whatever's, you know, unbeatable? It's kind of like, with Mothman, it's, the definitive book for me has been done, and that's Keel's Mothman Prophecies, and yes, other people have provided good books on the subject, you know, but I think they'll never surpass. That's not meant as a criticism. No, I think anybody that works in that realm, my friend Andy Colvin, who writes extensively on Mothman, stuff, but Andy will admit in a heartbeat that that's the source code for the Mothman material. And it's kind of like, you know, some third generation punk band trying to be better than the Sex Pistols or whatever, you know. It's not going to happen. You know, I don't care what they say, it's not going to happen. You started out writing basically rock journalism. Is that correct? Well, yeah, I still do a lot of that actually now. I mean, you know, when you're sort of like it's like any self-employed job, you know, you've got to stay on top of it. You know, or the water bill doesn't get paid, or the electric bill doesn't get paid. You know, you got to project ahead, and you know, when you're freelance writing, it can be a very precarious job at the best of times, and a lot of it involves branching out into different areas. So, yeah, I started when I was about 17, when I lived back in England, on a magazine called Zero, which was like a new startup magazine in the town I was living in at the time, and it sort of covered music, fashion, entertainment for sort of mid to late teens, early 20s people. And I did that for a couple of years, and, you know, got basically sort of thrown in at the deep end, which is actually really the best way to do it. You know, it's kind of like sink or swim, and you've got to learn to swim. And it sort of opened me up to all the different avenues of what goes on behind the scenes in terms of writing and researching and interview techniques, all this sort of stuff. And I found I liked it, and it opened doors, and, you know, I began doing writing for paranormal magazines because, you know, that was an area of interest. But then I thought, well, you know, why don't I sort of focus on these other areas that I'm also interested in? So I still do that, a lot of that today. I mean, I do, just recently I do a lot of sort of top 10 sort of comedy, sort of light-hearted stuff for different magazines, like top 10 rock stars who should be dead but aren't, you know, things like that. I do loads of that sort of stuff. I do a lot of things like top 10 tips to cure migraines or sunstroke, and I do writing for animal magazines. I'm a feature writer for Penthouse, which a lot of people don't know about. Gosh, I've lost track of Penthouse. I've not been that young and that single for so long, but yeah. So, you know, but I guess in terms of paranormal stuff, that's what I'm probably more known for. But, you know, I'm one of these sort of people that I think anybody in a self-employed job, you don't turn work down, you know, because, you know, it's a self-employed gig, you know, you've got to... I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm deeply passionate about what I do, but it's also, you know, it's also my job. You know, so. But you're writing from your passion. I get the sense and the reason I went there is you mentioned the Sex Pistols, and that evokes all kinds of memories for me, especially. Punk rock was kind of one of those sea change moments, both in the UK and I was in New York in the late 1970s when the punk scene was emerging there as well. So
it's kind of evocative to think back to that period of time, and the people who were involved with the scenes are passionate about it.
Well, that's an important thing, you know. I mean, as I said, although it's my job, I mean, I couldn't do it if I wasn't passionate and excited every day, kind of enthused to get out there and do it, and, you know, think this is a great story, let's chase it down, you know, to the extent we're able to. The day that goes away, you know, is the day I'll do something else, you know, so, and hopefully it won't go away. So
how much of a progression was it for you to go from reporting on pop culture to moving into the realm of the paranormal? Because in a lot of ways, the two spheres are kind of similar.
Well, yeah, I mean, in terms of the paranormal, you know, it wasn't like, oh, I've just discovered the paranormal, you know. I was sort of, when I was 5 years old, my mum and dad took me to Scotland on a week's holiday, and we spent a day at Loch Ness. I mean, Dad told me the story of the Loch Ness Monster, and, you know, as I was like 9 or 10, I was buying books on things like Mothman back then, and Nessie and Bigfoot. So I'd had that interest, you know, even as a little kid. But in terms of sort of branching out, it wasn't like a shock in terms of the subject matter. It was just a realization, and this is something that I think most writers find, if not all of them, obviously, that when you're writing for different audiences, you have to sort of change or, you know, modify your writing styles.
Yeah.
You know, in terms of, sometimes, you know, you write in the first person. I mean, a lot of my stuff on cryptozoology, I sort of write it as it occurred in like a diary road trip format. Other books, you know, it's very straightforward of, you know, on the night of the 10th of June 1956, Mr. Smith saw ABC, you know, and you have to sort of realize the genre you're writing for, you know, where humor and intrigue and, you know, excitement's applicable, or where you just keep it to the bare facts, you know, or whatever.
Yeah, and you started out writing, was cryptozoology sort of your initial foray into writing in the paranormal?
It was kind of a bit of both with that, with UFOs. I mean, there's certain areas of the paranormal I am interested in. There's some I'm not particularly interested in, and I don't mean that as a criticism. It's just, you know, you're just not going to be into everything. I mean, ghost stuff has never really sort of caught my interest.
Yeah,
I've never really been into that, and things like you know, astrology and tarot cards. And again, I'm not saying because there's nothing to it. It's just it doesn't get me excited, you know, so I don't deal with it. But the two main areas that sort of my sort of big passions in the paranormal are UFOs and cryptozoology. And I actually prefer the cryptozoology because I enjoy getting on the road and looking for these things. You know, it's kind of like with the UFO encounter. You know, you can get a great story, but if you get it sort of 2 weeks down the line and it was just something strange crossing the sky, there's not much you can do with a story like that. But if you've got like an existing area of forest where there's been, you know, a century of Bigfoot reports, well, at least you can go out there and know that potentially there's something there, you know. So I kind of get more enthused by, you know, the whole issue of jumping in the car, you know, tires screeching, heading off into, you know, mystery land, if you like.
How much impact did the Rendlesham Forest incident have on you, the impact?
Oh, yeah, I would say a lot. I'll tell you, the reason being that, you know, Britain, England, Scotland and Wales combined isn't a big country. You know, it's like only 800 miles long. So it's kind of like, you know, in, say, for example, New York, you know, you'll get the New York Times newspaper. In LA, you would get, I know, the LA Times or whatever. So everybody's getting their own bit of news. In Britain, the newspapers are all national newspapers, so no matter where you live, everybody gets to see the same news. You know, I mean, you have your little regional newspapers as well, but there are national newspapers like the Daily Mail, the Times, the Observer, the Daily Star, and they're all, you know, so if something happens, everybody's talking about it. And that's how the Rendlesham Forest case became so big, because all the newspapers picked it up and everybody in the country knew about it. And because when this story first surfaced in the 80s, it had so much credibility attached to it, because most of the people involved were military personnel. You know, they weren't people who weren't used to dealing with stressful, incidents or encounters or unpredictability, that kind of thing. They were actually dealing with, the sort of state-of-the-art military equipment, sort of do-or-die potential situations with the Soviets. This was the height of the Cold War. So that issue alone, without the UFO angle, when you've got highly credible witnesses, that is sort of a plus. And then, of course, talking about this UFO and strange creatures in the woods off the coast of England, the strange lights in the sky, military cover-ups, massive files supposedly being compiled on it. And for me, it is sort of a definitive British Roswell, if you like. I think that's probably the closest way we could describe it. And I think, when you get good, solid cases like this, it does sort of spur you on more to dig into it, because you realize you're not wasting your time, when people like this are actually having the encounters themselves.
Did you find that the witnesses and the people who subsequently followed up on Rendlesham were credible, and their credibility sustained over a long period of time? I know there was an attempt last year to kind of rewrite the whole thing, and it kind of didn't work out because a lot of people stood up and said, wait a minute, there's too many first-hand witnesses, there's too many voices involved here. How well do you think the original story has stood up now over time? We're 20-some years past that.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's actually 32 years ago now.
Wow.
It was 1980.
Okay. Yeah, it is.
1980. Yeah, so, but yeah, I mean, I think the most important thing is that, the guys who were involved at the time, some of them, they're only like 20, 21. So they're only sort of, 50 now. It's not like the 70 or 80-year-old guys who can't remember what happened or anything like that, or it's sort of just in the faded, distant past. And, they've all kind of stood their ground and said, well, hang on a minute, we saw these lights, and some of them saw the objects, others talked about seeing these weird little, almost like phantom-like creatures in the woods, and they've said, we were there, you weren't, to the skeptics or the debunkers. We know what we saw. We know we were silenced by the superiors and told not to talk about it, etc., etc., and it doesn't matter what you say or what you believe. We didn't mistake a lighthouse or shooting stars or meteorites or whatever. This was something close up, sort of 30, 50 feet away, not something in the distance in the sky. And I think, again, you can take UFOs out of the equation, but if somebody 30 years after talks about a specific event and they're very sort of forthright in their opinion on it because they were involved in it, that to me is a sign of a good quality witness, because, why get so enthused and worked up over something that was a big nothing, and 32 years down the line even, if there's nothing to it, people would move on. But the fact that they're still so deeply dug into it, if you like, and it profoundly changed their lives, to me that's a good thing, because it demonstrates the strength of the case even after more than 30 years. I
think unlike Roswell, which is its closest, I guess, historical parallel here in the U.S., it's fresher in memory, and like you said, the witnesses are younger. Roswell, to me, feels like we're never really going to get to the bottom of it. It feels like it's been rewritten too many times and respun and turned into a tourist attraction rather than the solid research that we would have liked to have seen done when the tracks were fresh. What's your take on that, Nick?
Well, yeah, I would actually agree with you, Andy. I think, for me, and I made this sort of analogy in blog posts and articles, that for me, Roswell, although it's an important case, has become almost like an American equivalent of Britain's Jack the Ripper, where you have this very old mystery with lots of different theories, conflicting scenarios and ideas, rumors of a government cover-up in both cases, but it's so long ago that, certainly in the Jack the Ripper case, everybody's dead, and in Roswell, there's just a handful of people left now who were around at the time. I mean, even Jesse Marcel Jr., who was a little boy at the time, he's sort of pushing 80 now himself, so unfortunately the day will come when there really won't be many of these people left. In fact, we're there already. And I think the problem is, it's like when that day comes when there is no one left, then it's like, well, how do we take it further? The government's saying, well, we think it's a balloon and crash test dummies. But even the government said, well, we went looking, but we couldn't find the files, but that's what we think it is. It's not like they're saying we found the files and you're all wrong. They said, well, we didn't actually find anything. And I sometimes wonder if they were telling the truth, because the real secret is hidden almost by like a secret government within the government. Maybe the official government is telling the truth when it says it went looking and found nothing. But, you have these stories about sort of almost like rogue elements within government, and I think that it could be these places where the secret's held. But that makes it a bigger problem, because you're not even be able to get this stuff through the Freedom of Information Act. And I think, although Roswell's a great case, I think one of the big mistakes of ufology is almost kind of like putting all its eggs in one basket, so to speak, and making Roswell the do-or-die case. There are actually hundreds of extremely credible and solid UFO cases out there of a very different nature, but clearly point to something visiting and interacting with us. But there seems to be like an inordinate amount of research into Roswell, or focus, I should say, on Roswell at the expense of much of the rest of the history and legend of the subject.
Yeah, I have tended to stay away from Roswell as a broad subject. It comes up in interviews, and I'll entertain it. But like I said, the tracks aren't fresh anymore. It's become a basically a caricature of what it once was. You are out talking to people on a pretty regular basis, as you're doing right now, and you're talking to people who are in MUFON and people who are actually involved day to day in UFO investigations. What are they telling you, Nick, about the current state of disclosure, and I use that term, and very tightly cloaked, disclosure about state-of-the-art UFO sightings and documentation?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, one of the things I've found, and a lot of other researchers have found, is the way in which the UFO phenomenon has changed, just in 60 years. A lot of people are noticing this, from the angle that, 60 years ago we had flying saucers. Then in the 50s we had sort of the contactee cases and a lot of stories about UFO landings and aliens being seen taking soil samples, and contactee cases, in remote mountainous areas, deserts, etc. Then the abduction thing sort of kicked off in the 60s through the 70s and 80s. And it seems today those sort of really profound incidents are actually not as prevalent as they were 30 or 40 years ago. We rarely get today the classic alien or UFO landing cases, where somebody's driving home late at night and they see this thing land and these creatures come out and sort of, there's a missing time period. Even abductions seem to have dropped off the scale a bit, as if the phenomenon is becoming more and more sort of, I won't say less frequent, but distant in terms of interacting with us or engaging in what seems to be some sort of very in-depth program on the Earth. It's almost, they're keeping their distance today compared to years before. And I'm finding a lot of researchers are saying that, and even the nature of the reports, they're still significant. People are still seeing strange things in the skies. But the number of reports where, as I said, somebody's driving home and sees something near the edge of the road and these little creatures, scurry off into it and it zooms into the sky. All those classic reports in the 50s and 60s, they just barely get reported anymore. So I think that's interesting. And in terms of disclosure, it kind of depends who you ask. I mean, there are people in the field who firmly believe UFO disclosure is going to come via, a government statement or announcement that, yes, hey, ABC is going on. Yeah. I would like to see that. My personal opinion, though, is that I always take the view, and maybe it's kind of like, I know, a bit of a jaded approach, but, it's kind of like, why would the government do that? Because it's going to open such a floodgate of awkward questions that the government is going to be in such a position, a very awkward position, of having to address some very awkward issues. And I can't see what is to the government's advantage to admit it's lied for 65, 70 years about this phenomenon. but which by default makes it look bad. So, I would like to see disclosure, but, maybe it's just me being cynical about government, but I take the view that just because X number of thousand people say, hey, tell us the truth, that the government's going to say, oh, okay. I just don't really see that happening. But, the only way I could is if there is an agenda to release everything because people in government feel it's the time. That's very different from people pushing to get it released. 1 million signatures to Obama is, it's great that there are people galvanized to do that. But the real power players, I don't think that would make a single bit of difference to them, if they really don't want that material releasing.
Yeah, I kind of looked at that whole thing as sort of futility. And I said so publicly in a blog post, and I know I talked to Rich Dolan about it and several other people, and it seems like people were sitting around waiting for government to tell them something that's been pretty obvious for a very long time, maybe hundreds, maybe even thousands of years, that there is something out there. And that disclosure, so-called, is simply a matter of personal experience. Those who have experienced it, and I talked to plenty of them, know it's true. They don't need to prove it. But it seems to me like the whole disclosure movement has the trappings of, exopolitics, this idea that we can make this a political issue. I don't think that's going to happen.
No, I mean, the thing is, it's not like, sort of voting in your local town, whether to get rid of the most recent sort of red lights that have been set up in the town. This is sort of a huge secret that's being held by powerful players that don't want this information to come out. I think there actually is kind of like a battle going on behind the scenes of people who may want the information to come out, but the ones who are sort of sitting on the treasure, so to speak, they don't. I think that's the problem, is identifying them and trying to get this material, but it's how we do it. And I just think lobbying, in a political sense, just isn't going to cut it.
It doesn't seem to work for much of anything. But
no, even politics, it doesn't work.
No, not at all. No, it doesn't work anywhere. But you did bring up kind of an interesting point that I want to back up on a little bit, how the whole UFO scene's changed over time. One of the things that I've noticed is that even craft themselves have tended to morph and change with the periods of time in which they were observed and discovered. If you go back and you look at reports and drawings from even the early part of the 20th century, and then you move it forward in stages, the 50s had a flavor, the 60s had a flavor. What are we dealing with? Something that is changing with our perceptions? Are we dealing with something that, I don't like the term mass delusion, because I don't think that many people can be that wrong, but there's a cultural or a time aspect to this that seems to morph and change?
Yeah, I actually think there is. I mean, I've written about this, particularly in my Contactees book, the way in which the phenomenon does seem to reflect the beliefs and subconscious ideas of the people of that era. That's to say, we go back to, say, the latter parts of the 19th century, where there was the mystery airship sightings. These weren't people seeing flying saucers, which they called airships. They were describing them as looking like the sort of early airships that existed around about that time. Then in the 1940s, during the Second World War, we had these glowing balls of light, the Foo Fighters. Then in 46, over Scandinavia, we had the ghost rockets. Flying saucers kicked off in the summer of 47. Late 70s, early 80s onwards, you had the flying triangles. So the technology, or the craft, if you like, have changed. Even the entities over the years have changed. The 50s, people were talking about long-haired, very humanoid-looking aliens. Today, it's these sort of fetus-like greys. And in between them was sort of these creatures from the Betty and Barney Hill case, which actually weren't like the 3-foot-tall greys. They were sort of like 5-foot-tall, slightly more human-looking, almost as if they were like a crossover point between the Space Brothers of the 50s and the Greys of today. Then suddenly we had the reptilians pop up and the praying mantises, And my personal view is that there's a very real, genuine, unexplained UFO phenomenon amongst us. I'm not entirely sure if it's extraterrestrial or, as people talk about, interdimensional, what it is. But I think that it has the ability to alter the way it's perceived by the people it encounters or that encounter it. That's to say, it's almost, if you imagine sort of being plunged into like a real life Matrix type world where you're living in some sort of artificial hologram that looks 100% real. I sometimes wonder if the phenomenon has a reason which we're not seeing for interacting with us, but it does so in differing ways according to the beliefs, perceptions, ideologies, mythologies, folklores of the people of that era. And when people say, oh, there are parallels between fairy encounters 500 years ago and aliens today, well, maybe people really did see them in that form 500 years ago, and 2,000 years ago they saw them as demons, and today they see them as aliens. But maybe it's really the same thing, and it's the eye of the beholder, if you like, that is being manipulated by the phenomenon.
Well, yeah, and we're in a technological era. The magical mind was a component of the world, certainly the medieval times, 12th, 13th, 14th centuries. In that period, there was a different, I guess, consciousness in terms of how the perception of the paranormal was received. It was sort of funneled through a mind that connected more with the magical realms than with the world of technology as we know it now. I mean, if you just look at how much difference is there between magic and technology really anyway?
Well, yeah, I mean, there are some cases, for example, when people talk about magic, it's very often a misunderstanding that somebody has like a magic wand and waves it and says hocus pocus, and pulls a rabbit out of a hat. Traditional magic, that's not what it is. Traditional magic often involves, sort of the person getting into almost like a trance-like altered state and sort of opening a gateway or a veil to another realm where all sorts of fantastic possibilities exist. And you're communing with higher entities or differing entities, which is a very different situation. And I think certainly in the past, I think ancient man had far more of an understanding of, magic as it is in its literal primal terms than what it's known today, and they use their minds in a very different way that we do. They understood more the importance of things like synchronicities, and to sort of follow instinct, which was sort of perceived as actually being almost like a paranormal skill, instinct and synchronicities as guiding tools, how to literally live your life rather than just, it's just one of those weird things that occasionally happen,
So that perception seems to morph and shape. The groups that are investigating out there, their case files, what do they see as a trend now? Is there anything distinctive? I mean, we're in 2012. People were expecting all kinds of, shit to hit the fan. People were expecting all kinds of events to happen. Is any of this showing up in the phenomena that's being recorded and observed by researchers?
Well, unfortunately, Randy, I'd have to say that, it's kind of like we're in, I won't say a quiet spot in terms of UFO activity, because there are sightings going on all the time. What we're not getting is really significant encounters. People are seeing weird stuff in the sky, strange lights at night, but, it's not like there are massive amounts of landings and creature cases all over the place. I mean, you can go back in time and see really significant eras when there was major UFO activity, like 1952, over DC, when you had these sightings over the course of 2 weekends, which almost like an Independence Day, War of the Worlds invasion. Got the Air Force and the FBI and the White House all in a major state of concern. Then, of course, you had the original wave in 47. 1973, all across the U.S., that was a major wave of UFO activity.
Absolutely.
The Belgian sightings with the flying triangles in 89. Or, the Phoenix Lights in 97. But today, it actually does seem like, I won't say the phenomenon's gone away, because it clearly hasn't, but it's like there's a definite backing off and a definite lack of these classics. You know, we don't have the days anymore of like the Zamora landing, you know, or Kelly Hopkinsville, or the Flatwoods Monster, you know, or Mothman, that kind of thing. We haven't got those classic ongoing events that sort of, you know, 300-page books are written about on a regular basis. And granted, you know, there have been other times in the history of the UFO phenomenon where it has sort of come in peaks and drops, etc. But, you know, this one seems to be going on a long time in terms of really good definitive events. And does that mean they're sort of pulling back from us, or does it mean the work's done and the only thing left to do now is to expose themselves to us? You know, you can look at it from both angles, you know, depending on your own perspective, I guess.
And it kind of goes back to that show that you and I did a couple of years ago about the Collins Elite. Yeah. I think there were so many stacked expectations around 2012 and this particular period of time that we're in now, where we were looking for a high water mark, and in fact what we have is a ravine in a sense. We've kind of hit the ditch in terms of what we would consider empirical evidence, but there are other things going on right now. There is other activity, and some of it to me feels kind of ominous as well. We live in a dangerous world mostly because of human beings, not of alien threats. Anything that you're seeing right now in terms of base activities, things like that, military installations, I know you've written on this extensively, and this seems to be an area that is kind of heated up a bit. Yeah,
I would agree. I think, you know, you can take UFOs out of the equation, and you can see that, you know, in the last certainly 5-6 years, there's been a massive increase where, you know, we seem to be going further and further down this sort of Big Brother 1984 type situation. Not through, you know, some group taking over, you know, the government or whatever, where it'd be totally visible. But it's almost like an undercurrent, you know, where a new law gets quietly passed. The government announces, well, you know, we're going to make an amendment to this act, so if we need to, you know, we can monitor your phone calls, but if you've done nothing wrong, you know, it doesn't matter if we're watching you. You know, that old line that people say, well, I don't mind if the government's watching me, I haven't done anything wrong. You know, it's kind of an appalling attitude to have. You know, they shouldn't be watching you in the first place if you've done nothing. But it's what I find most ominous is that people take the view that, well, it's just the world we live in, we've got to accept we're being monitored. You know, I mean, no. I mean, we lived through a Second World War, you know, with the worst situation you can imagine, with Adolf Hitler trying to take over the world and basically creating entire camps where he tried to just exterminate a whole race. But that didn't lead after post-1945 to a world where we're all put under, you know, surveillance 24/7 or whatever. So why should that be the case now? It's kind of ironic. It's like, well, to keep your freedom, you've got to give up some of your freedom. Well, we didn't have to do it after the war. We used common sense, and we made sure that if you're going to fight an enemy who wants you to lose your freedom, you have to understand what it is you're fighting for. So you have to retain that freedom. But today it's like, well, no, you can't retain your freedoms. You've got to give them up to preserve them, you know, which is just crazy. And I do see us going more and more down that line where people say, well, you know, if there's cameras everywhere and they want to listen in, well, that's how the world is. Well, it doesn't have to be like that. You can fight an enemy or you can live in a dangerous world, but still retain the character of what the country or whichever country it is, you know, should be. So.
Yeah, I mean, you look at London right now, there's cameras all over the place in London. The UK has, you know, installed this whole Big Brother situation, and it's happened here in the US. If you look up at a traffic light and you notice the cameras overlooking the intersections, you realize that, yeah, that's going on, and that there's cameras mounted on buildings all over the place. I assume there's technology that we're not visibly aware of as well.
And I think the other disturbing thing, you know, there's actually, you know, there's different facets of it in different countries. You're quite right. You know, Britain has more cameras per people in the population than anywhere in the world. I mean, some of them are just, somebody puts them up outside of a store just so that anybody breaks it at night. It's not like they're all government ones, but a lot of the ones around London are. But you have less over here, and it's growing. But the one big difference, which I think is kind of a disturbing aspect of that over here, which you see less in England, is particularly like kids being isolated. Like when I was growing up in England, you'd all be riding your bike around town till 9 o'clock, and, it's 8 years old, my mum and dad say, well, where are you going? I said, we're going down the 2 miles down the road. Nobody thought about it. You still get that in Britain today. Kids ride their bikes around town and whatever and play outside until 9. But I find over here, you don't get that. It's more they're indoors all the time, and people don't talk to the neighbours much. In England, everybody sort of chats over the fence or hangs out and whatever, But I think that's happened where you're almost encouraged to stay indoors for fear of what might happen if you go outside. You know what I mean? It's
this culture of isolation that's developed, and it is an American concept. I grew up living in a small town in the 1960s and 70s where, exactly that. We'd be riding our bikes. We'd be out till 9 or 10 o'clock at night. Nobody had any fear about something happening to us. It's not that the potential dangers weren't there. It was that it wasn't in our consciousness as a danger like it is now. It's like we're almost afraid to actually live anymore.
That's what it is, right?
Yeah, I mean, people are living on their computers now. They're living in a virtual realm.
Yeah, and that's why, for me, I always, as I said, I keep what I do, although it's a passion and a job, I like to keep it at job hours because, if I'm literally in the middle of a Word document, come 5 o'clock, I'll finish that sentence, close it down, save it, and then I'll, put the TV on, watch a football game, a soccer game, or if I want my friends up, do you want to go out somewhere, let's go and, hang out or whatever, and do social things. For me, Facebook, etc., it's great to catch up with friends on the other side of the world, but for me, Facebook isn't socializing. Facebook helps you keep in touch with people, which is a very different thing to socializing,
Yeah. In terms of how you work, you do a lot of field work, don't you, Nick?
Yeah, I mean, I think field work is, it's vital. The main reason being that, while the internet is a great resource tool, which we could not live without today, it makes our job so much easier in terms of verifying facts, data, names, where somebody was born, that kind of thing. Whereas 20 years ago, you'd have to go to your local library and get an autobiography out about this person or that person just to get the information. But if I read a book by someone, and I apply these rules to me as well, if I read a book by somebody else, I don't want to pick it up and think, well, hang on, this person's just rewritten the first 10 pages of the Mothman Prophecies, or the Bermuda Triangle. I want to see that they've spent some effort to actually find out if these stories are true by going out there, doing investigations, tracking the people down. It's kind of like I always try and apply investigative journalistic techniques to what I do, regardless of the subject matter. Just because it's not like a political story doesn't mean you can't apply the same techniques to investigating, say, the Loch Ness Monster or whatever. It should be the same approach. And I think there's even in today's world, there's no better alternative than actually sort of, strapping on your boots, so to speak, and then getting them dirty by doing field studies, because you can learn a great deal about Bigfoot, for example, on the internet. You're not going to find Bigfoot on the internet. If it's a real living animal, it's in the woods. You've got to get out to the woods,
Kind of backing into this new book of yours, The World's Weirdest Places. Have you gone to locations where, yes, you're looking for evidence, yes, you're looking for something hard and fast, but maybe what you come away with is a certain sense, a certain feeling for that particular place that I don't want to get real, spacey here, but kind of the vibration of the place, the sense of the place, the sense that something unique has occurred in that particular geographic location?
Yeah. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt about that. I mean, the book, The World's Weirdest Places, it's basically a study of 25 of my sort of favourite places around the world, which are sort of definitive hotspots for weirdness. And of those 25, I think I've visited 15 of them, and the only reason I haven't visited the others is simply, I don't have the money to jump on a plane every other day and, jet off to Australia or India or whatever, But there are more than half of them I've visited, and the rest, I've investigated and researched extensively. But, yeah, a lot of the places I've been, which feature in the book, they do have that sort of hard-to-define sense or feeling of weirdness about them. When you go there, you can just tell there's something strange about the area that it's difficult to pinpoint, except for the fact that, a great deal of strange stuff has happened. It's like Loch Ness in Scotland. Loch Ness, everybody obviously thinks of the Loch Ness Monster, but Loch Ness is, a very large body of water. It's like 22 miles long, a mile wide, and about 800 feet deep. It's very sort of creepy and mysterious looking place, very dark water, these huge hills surrounding it, a number of ruined castles on the shore. But when you get there, rather than it just being a loch filled with, a mysterious creature or creatures allegedly, it does have this sort of hard-to-define sense of there's been something not quite right, something ancient and primal and, something deeply locked in our subconscious that we can't necessarily fully understand, but we know there's something weirdly mysterious and significant about the area. And Loch Ness, this will sort of give people an idea of the sort of things I talk about in the book. People think of Nessie, but there have been a wide range of mysteries at Loch Ness. For example, Aleister Crowley, the famous occultist in the early part of the 20th century, had a house on the shores of Loch Ness called Boleskine House, which was later owned by Jimmy Page from Led Zeppelin. Crowley actually tried to summon up demons while he was on the shores of Loch Ness. There have been big cat reports, like big sightings of huge black cats roaming the shore. There have been UFO encounters over the loch. In 1974, a well-known Loch Ness Monster researcher named Ted Holliday actually had an encounter also near the shores of Loch Ness with nothing less than like a full-blown man in black. So, you've got men in black, UFO encounters, Nessie, Aleister Crowley summoning up demons, all in the vicinity of this weird, mysterious old lake. And, to go out there and sort of travel to the sites, these different hot spots where, Crowley's house existed, and et cetera, to me, that's all vital to have an understanding of what it is you're writing about, where you can sort of transcribe those thoughts, if you like, into a chapter of a book.
I'm guessing you didn't swim out into the Bermuda Triangle.
No, that's one of those places where, it's kind of like being dropped out sort of 10 miles out to sea, you're not going to make it back probably, so, regardless of where you are or not.
But what is your takeaway in terms of what this phenomena in the Bermuda Triangle is? This is one of the lingering mysteries, and it wraps itself around disappearing planes, disappearing ships. Amelia Earhart figures into it as well. It seems like there's a portal or a vortex or something that's kind of in action there.
Yeah, that's what a lot of people actually take the view, that it's not so much, just things going wrong, but there's like a static vortex or a window area, as John Keel used to call them, that possibly, opens us up to other realms of existence, kind of like a door opening, so to speak. But, the first thing I would say, sort of as a preface, is that, that oceans are hazardous places at the best of times. And so, of course, even if there have been, accidents, deaths, disappearances in the Bermuda Triangle, we do get those all around the world. So, some of them can just be written off as inexperienced people getting disorientated. But in saying that, the Bermuda Triangle does seem to have far more than its fair share of, disappearances, people getting disoriented, radioing in with weird messages, and the whole area just seems saturated in phenomena like this. And of course, there's a number of theories. When we talk about window areas in the Bermuda Triangle, that doesn't necessarily just mean something coming in and out. Mm-hmm. You have this sort of potential of people being sucked in, or planes or ships being sucked in, or kidnapped, or possibly just through some science that we don't understand, something just perhaps like quantum physics, which allows for the existence of other dimensions. Maybe these rifts or portals occur randomly and naturally, and, something just sails through with, for 1 second they're here, the next second they're gone. But there are a lot of other theories. Is it UFOs? The Edgar Cayce, for example, came to believe that possibly Atlantis was somewhere in that area, and there are a lot of stories about energy crystals that perhaps ancient man had developed as a weapon that occasionally flare up, and or basically at random, not deliberately, just these old machines still working somewhere deep under the ocean, sending a blast up which, destroys something at 2,000 feet in the sky or whatever,
Yeah, well, and some of the legends of Atlantis seem to indicate that the cataclysm that took Atlantis was directly attributable to a misuse of some sort of dark energy, as I understand it.
Yeah, you can look back into, the ancient past, and although a lot of people sort of say, well, it's just legends and folklore and rumors, when you sort of look at it critically, we find a lot of cases where it seems that, people are talking about technologies that are very different to ours, highly alternative, where we may not be talking about missiles, tanks, fighter planes, but sort of a technology that maybe doesn't even involve that much machinery, almost like an earth energy type of thing that's harnessed. And maybe there wouldn't be much in the way of remnants and evidence left of it, if it was sort of really alternative. But you find a lot of stories of highly advanced civilizations in the past supposedly having developed, really weird and novel technologies, only, as you said, to misuse them, and, became their downfall, which, you could argue that 50,000 years from now, there could be the equivalent of me and you having a conversation about, there was supposedly this civilization that existed, and they had countries with names like Russia and America, and the host would be saying to the equivalent to me, Jim, that's just nonsense, it's folklore. We could go the same way. I think there's a very good argument, and this isn't me being pessimistic, I think a very good argument could be made that as a civilization so-called advances, that it reaches that tipping point where it can have a great future, or it can really reach obliteration point. It's kind of like our world today. You could argue that sort of the latter years of the 20th century were perhaps, sort of the 60s onwards was sort of the golden age. Today we're seeing populations growing, people getting more and more unhealthy, kids, developing diabetes at like 8 or 9. More and more of them, it's like everything, it's like the health is getting worse, the population's increasing, resources are getting less, the temperatures and the weather's clearly changing in different ways, and who knows, what the future might bring. The planet cannot sustain. One of the estimates is that, the planet is going to have sort of a couple more billion people in 20 years from now. 20 years after that, a couple billion more. Where are they all going to live? Where's all the food and the fuel for cars and everything else going to come from? It could reach that critical tipping point where everything just collapses in on itself, and, we're forced to start again to a degree.
Yeah, and I've had that conversation with people, and even many years ago, maybe back in the 80s, this idea of a terminal generation where you begin to see the gradual slide. And I think, to be optimistic about it, that's completely in the hands of the humans who are here and their decisions.
You're right.
And a lot of the things that you investigate and that we talk about, I think in a lot of ways, they're coded messages. They're reminders of vestigial pasts that are signaling to us. And, you know, the dark side of science fiction has always been the idea of these apocalyptic scenarios. Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke is, you know, one of those books that always kind of gets me to that point, because I think about how, you know, at the end of the book, basically you have that terminal generation and what it becomes. And so, you know, a lot of your research, a lot of your work is around some pretty wild, weird things, but in a sense, I think it forces you to deal with reality on a different level, especially the reality of the world we live in now.
Yeah, and I think, you know, when you dig into this sort of stuff, you don't just sort of focus on the mystery. It does sort of open your mind up to, well, you know, what does this mean in the bigger picture? And, you know, when you talk about sort of, you know, one particular era where there's like this tipping point and disasters and cataclysms, I think all of us, you know, and I think we actually all kind of think of it in a similar fashion. You know, these stories of like disasters in the past, like Atlantis and floods, worldwide floods and cataclysms, we all seem to have like a very vague memory or idea that it's true, even though we didn't live then. But we all seem to, it resonates with us, you know, that there were these disasters in the past, and we sort of vaguely have this subconscious imagery, you know, of worldwide floods and mountains moving. Yeah. Do you know what I mean?
It's kind of a race memory.
Yeah, like a race memory, but we've got fragments of it, but it resonates with all of us. And I think, you know, maybe there is something to the idea of like an inherited memory of significant events, and part of it may be kind of like a subconscious fail-safe to try and prevent it from happening again. But, you know, maybe it's like nature. You know, maybe it's like anything, you know, that a race or a creature gets too populous in one area, you know, and it's forced to move on, or, you know, nature finds a way to get rid of it because it becomes like an infestation, and maybe nature perceives us as an infestation, you know, and something will rise up and strike out, and, you know, that was the good old human race, you know, here today, gone later today.
Some of these creatures over the years that you've investigated in terms of, you know, the cryptozoological material, do you have the sense that maybe some of these creatures never went away, but they somehow managed to submerge themselves either physically or even in some way dimensionally within our present construct? In other words, Bigfoot. You take Bigfoot and all the sightings over the years, and it appears as though that is a very tangible phenomenon. And it's been widely dispersed over large areas, different cultures, so we know that it wasn't a cultural icon. But it seems to me that it's entirely possible that because of where we are, we've detached from the natural world in a way that we no longer perceive the natural world with the same eyes that our forefathers would have.
No, you're right. I mean, Bigfoot's sort of a big interest of mine. And I mean, when I was a kid, you know, Bigfoot for me was like a giant ape. The Loch Ness Monster was, you know, a surviving creature from the prehistoric era. The Yeti was, again, like a, you know, something akin to Bigfoot, like a giant ape. But, you know, the more I dug into these mysteries of these strange creatures, and the fact that they're always so elusive, we never see one, you know, racing across the road that gets hit by a car, they never get shot and killed, we never stumble across a dead body, ever. The one thing that sort of typifies all these creatures, which collectively are known as cryptids, is that they're overwhelmingly elusive. And particularly in Bigfoot reports, we often get sightings, you know, in conjunction with other weird phenomena such as strange lights in the sky, UFO activity, reports of Bigfoot sort of winking out in a flash of light, things like this. And, you know, although a lot of people in sort of mainstream cryptozoology, I often butt heads with them because, you know, they're like, oh, Nick's on one of his sort of paranormal monster trips, when really, you know, it's just a giant ape. But the fact is that when you look into these cases very deeply, you find a lot of aspects which are totally illogical. I mean, you know, me originally coming from Britain, we get a lot of reports of Bigfoot-type creatures seen in the woods of Britain, and the mountains. But Britain's 800 miles long, with a population which of a full 20% of the U.S. population. Imagine if 20% of the U.S. population lived in a country only 800 miles long. That's how densely packed Britain is. And yet we get reports of 8-foot-tall apes running around. If there were 60 million people living in an 800-foot-long piece of land, there's no reason we should not be able to find at least one 8-foot-tall lumbering ape. But we don't. They're always one step ahead of us, and when we do go looking for them, they're gone. It literally is like they've flitted in and out of our reality. Now, when you go back if you look at the Native American Indian stories of Bigfoot, they didn't call it Bigfoot, back then. Bigfoot, the term was actually only coined in the 1950s. But the Native Americans had their stories about the so-called wild, hairy men of the mountains, particularly in the Pacific Northwest. But even the Native Americans didn't view these creatures as just, like a wolf or, a mountain lion or a coyote. They viewed them as creatures that sort of straddled the worlds between the physical world and, like, the magical world, if you like. They were creatures that could exist in our realm of reality, and what, for all intents and purposes, we might call a different dimension. And they were sort of highly mentally adept and skilled creatures. They might look like savage animals, but supposedly they were sort of deeply spiritual and had these techniques that allowed them to avoid us, to possibly even, deflect the way we look at them, kind of like, this is actually a really interesting area that's been researched, that they could have an effect on the human brain. Kind of like, if you go in the kitchen, you open the cupboard and you look for the salt, and you look for 30 seconds, you don't see it, and then you suddenly see it in front of you. Everybody's done that. It's staring you in the face, but you don't see it. One theory is that perhaps Bigfoot has the ability to affect the human mind to make that happen. So it looks like the creature's gone invisible, but your mind has been rendered and locked into that mode of not being able to see, the salt cellar in the cupboard. But if that is the case, again, it suggests Bigfoot and a lot of these creatures aren't just zoological oddities that science hasn't classified. That, for me, they're far stranger. I do believe they probably do sort of flit in and out of our reality from some other realm of reality, if you like.
I'm curious to know, in your travels and in your research, if different cultures tend to produce a preponderance of legends, mythologies, and maybe sort of culturally formed phenomena. In other words, most of the research that I deal with clearly is from people who come from a Western mindset. I do a lot of work with people in the UK, the US, Canada. Other cultures, what do they produce in terms of these artifacts?
Well, it's interesting, Randy, because although, different nations, different cultures have obviously sort of wildly varying titles for different phenomena that manifests, there's actually, and quite intriguingly, a lot of similarities. For example, most nations, most cultures have stories of strange winged creatures. Point Pleasant has Mothman. Down in South Texas, you have a lot of reports of so-called pterodactyl-type creatures that people see. Native Americans talked about the legendary Thunderbird. Britain has a weird creature known as the Owlman, which is like a glowing-eyed equivalent of Mothman. In the Philippines, in Guyana, in Gambia, they all have stories of like winged humanoid-type creatures. Most nations around the world have stories of lake monsters. Over here, we've got Ogopogo, Champ. We've got Nessie in Scotland. There's a creature in Wales in a lake there called Teggy. There's a lot of Russian and Scandinavian lake monsters. A creature called Michaeli and Bembe in the Congo, places like this. And so, in other words, you have those staple type animals. Then you have the hairy wild men. Of course, over here it's Bigfoot. Well, in the Himalayas, it's the abominable snowmen. Russia has its own equivalent called the almasty. China has the Yeren. Australia has the Yowie. So in other words, all these countries can be separated by thousands of miles and the cultures by centuries. But there are certain archetypal weird creatures and things that get seen. And of course the other big one is sort of the so-called little people. Everything from folkloric tales of leprechauns, fairies, goblins, even arguably the greys, the little greys of ufology today. They all have one thing in common. They're little people that sort of often surface at night and interact with the human race. Sometimes, they kidnap people and take them away. Other times they're sort of friendly and trickster-like, and sometimes they're downright malevolent. And, but they become a staple part of folklore, but that doesn't mean they didn't exist in some form. But all these different countries and cultures seem to have all those particular archetypes, the little people, the large, weird flying things living in lakes, the hairy wild men. These are all the archetypal things that every culture seems to have somewhere or other in its history.
Yeah, and they're actually reflected even going back into, oddly enough, Grimm's fairy tales. I mean, you look at that, and if you can overlay that a little bit onto the modern culture, you see that there's kind of a hint that the stuff's been going on for a very long time.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of like the whole UFO thing, where maybe the phenomena kind of changes to suit the perceptions of the era. Maybe one person's leprechaun is another person's grey. Who knows if the phenomenon didn't have the ability, to manipulate the human mind, so it actually sees what's reflected from the person's subconscious. Kind of like it's what you expect to see is what you're going to see.
You mentioned Russia, and I'm curious because it's not something I'm all that familiar with, but do they have a paranormal culture there as well?
Oh, yeah, I mean, it's a rich paranormal culture. When the Soviet Union was at its height, and it was sort of, under the iron fist of people like Stalin, research into a lot of paranormal stuff was actually discouraged. It wasn't sort of something that was promoted. But, the situation after the fall of the Soviet Union has changed a lot. And it changed a lot, actually, from the 50s onwards. But before that, it was sort of, something that was sort of frowned on and ignored mainly. But yeah, there are a lot of huge UFO research groups in Russia that existed since the 60s. There's a huge also cryptozoological community that embarks on expeditions looking for the Russian equivalent of Bigfoot, which is very often seen in the Caucasus Mountains, this huge remote area of mountainous land. What's interesting is their reports are more like sort of primitive humans, like, something like Cro-Magnon man or Neanderthal man, rather than just specifically large ape-like creatures, although they do get those as well. But as I said, they're called the almasty. A lot of sort of ghostly activity. You can go on ghost walks around Moscow. But a lot of haunted. The Kremlin's even supposed to be haunted. You can go on sort of Saturday night ghost walks, and so the situation isn't that much different to here or in Europe or wherever. I think it's just we just don't get to hear it as much. But the people are into it as much as anywhere else, really. So.
Yeah, somebody in the chat room brought up asking, are these perhaps interdimensional creatures?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, when I was a kid, everything was, I guess, like it is in any aspect of life when you're a kid. Everything's black and white, And then as you start to get older, you ask questions because your mind starts to change. And that's the same with me with the UFOs and all these different creatures. As I said, Bigfoot I thought was an ape. Nessie was a dinosaur. UFOs were alien craft. I would say certainly the last 15, 16 years, I've been more on the lines of John Keel's so-called window areas, this term that he coined. The idea that perhaps many of these phenomena, this would explain their sort of here 1 minute, gone the next approach, which is consistent. It's the one thing that is consistent. That would tie in more with the idea of portals or doorways or interdimensional phenomena. Now, things like quantum physics today sort of allowing for the existence of multi-dimensions. You know, the best way to explain it to people is that imagine you're in your car driving home somewhere, put the radio on, you don't like the song that's playing, so you switch channels. You don't like that song, so you switch again. You do it 4 or 5 times. All those channels are playing at the same time, all simultaneously, but you can only be tuned into one at any given moment. And it's kind of like the same thing. Maybe all these multi-dimensions exist, but if you know how to harness the technology or the skill to leap or jump from dimension to dimension, you could appear in one at any given moment and then vanish into the next one. And that might explain why it's so illogical that people see these massive apes in Britain where there clearly isn't enough food to support them or enough hiding places to support them, and then they vanish again. Or maybe the reason why they're so elusive and they don't get killed or hit by cars is because they actually aren't in our realm of existence for very long at any given time. And so for me, however we define, you know, something like interdimensional is more like a catch-all term, but I think something that coexists with us is far more likely than something consistently and successfully hiding from us on this plane of existence forever, or coming from another star system just to go all the way back again. I think sort of leaping through like a paranormal doorway is far more likely and feasible, I think.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting that you would say that. You know, it struck me too with John Cale, the Mothman, and what Andy Colvin and some other people brought out, is that the Mothman at different times appeared to be this almost harbinger. There was like, well, what would happen in West Virginia, basically you had a series of events that led to the collapse of a bridge on Christmas shopping season, and the Mothman made these numerous appearances. That these supernatural apparitions in some ways are, I guess, kind of what we talked about earlier, Nick. They're actually manifesting something that's kind of hidden in our subconscious.
Well, yeah, I mean, you know, this sort of goes into another area that I'm very interested in, which the area of so-called tulpas. A tulpa is like a Tibetan term, and it's basically what's known as a thought
How do you say that? How do you?
Tulpa, tulpa.
Okay, got it. Yep.
And basically, it's a Tibetan term, and it basically deals with what are called thought forms. The idea that, you know, if you have an imagery of something in your mind and it's such a strong sense of reality, if you like, the human mind can unknowingly or consciously kind of externalize it, and you give birth to kind of like a mind monster, if you like, that has some sort of like independent existence from the human mind, but that is inextricably tied to it. And the theory is that the tulpa lives on high states of human emotion, so the more people that see it and get frightened by it, the creature or whatever kind of thrives and bleeds on that energy, almost like a psychic vampire. Mm-hmm. You know, people have said, people who believe that like Bigfoot could be a tulpa take the view that, you know, we look at spooky woods and huge forests, and our subconscious primal part of our mind imagines there are monsters living in there. Well, if enough of us imagine that, maybe that imagination provokes these things to exist. And to survive, how do they survive? Well, if they survive on high states of human emotion, they have to ensure that they're seen. So maybe Bigfoot is seen when he kind of needs to feed on us, if you see what I mean. So, you know, again, this sort of ties in with this whole issue of perception and belief and, you know, how we interpret things and why we interpret. Maybe part of it is us externalizing something that then realize it enjoys this sort of freedom it's being given, and it becomes sort of tenacious of life and wants to cling on to it. And, you know, that's the thing with tulpas, the belief that, you know, if you're not careful, they become like some unruly, crazy, spoiled teenager, you know, that wants to sort of run crazily and you know, let go of the parents, so to speak. And but it's an interesting theory, the idea, you know, that the human mind, if you focus on one particular image for so long, then, you know, it's kind of like you get yourself in a trance-like state, and let's say you imagine a large black dog with glowing red eyes, and you focus on that image for weeks, and you nurture it, and you learn to get your mind in a trance-like state, semi-meditative state, and you see it more and more coming into semblance, then you imagine it charging down the street outside your house at midnight. And then, lo and behold, 2 weeks later, there's a story in the local newspaper. Somebody just 3 doors down saw this huge black dog with red eyes. Exactly what you're imagining. That's the idea of the tulpa, is that you give birth to something out of your mind that's semi-physical, semi-born of the imagination, but has kind of an independent existence as well.
Yeah, that's a whole interesting concept, and I suspect the inverse of that's true as well. But it seems like fear's the stronger driving force behind a lot of the phenomena.
Yeah, I think, there is something to be said in life for, your state of mind, or what you ask for, you get. It's kind of like when people dig into the paranormal, and a lot of people say, well, stay away from it because people have a lot of bad experiences. Well, that's true, they do. But maybe it's because subconsciously they're worried they're going to bring something bad through, when they start invoking things and conjuring them up. If they're subconsciously worried it's going to be a bad experience, maybe the phenomena, realizes this, and the ones that get the grips into the people are the really negative ones, It's kind of like you have a positive outlook on life, Studies have been done that actually has a positive effect on your mental and physical well-being as well. It's kind of like, this is nothing paranormal, but it's been shown that, people who own pets have a lower rate of depression than people who don't own pets, and that's because we're social animals. But I think mindset has a great deal of bearing upon the positive or negative nature of a lot of these experiences with entities that kind of get their grips into us one way or another.
Oh, it's weird because, I've interviewed a lot of people over the years, and I've interviewed abductees, and I've interviewed people who have had extremely positive experiences with what we'll call, for the sake of convenience, extraterrestrials. It's all over the map, and it's very polarized. It's like, I don't find too many people that vacillate between the two extremes. They've either been abducted and had horrible genetic experiments and been dealt badly with by men in black, or they have literally been lifted into a place of angels.
Well, it may be just as simple. Maybe we're over sort of analysing it. May be as simple as being in the right place at the right time with the right entities, or the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong ones. It could be just a luck of the draw. That I think with the UFO subject, it's always important to remember that, when we talk about the UFO subject, the UFO mystery, it makes it sound like it's one unified thing with one agenda.
Right.
The reality might be that there's multiple things going on. The very fact that there could be interdimensional creatures doesn't rule out or negate the idea that there could be extraterrestrials, or there could be time travelers, or there could be paranormal entities. Maybe it really is a case that the Earth's kind of like a testing ground for a whole range of different phenomena, but we try and simplify it by placing it all into one category, but then we get confused because we see people having good experiences and bad. Maybe we should look at, perhaps the good experiences that have nothing to do with the bad ones, except for the fact that they're both flying around in weird craft or whatever,
One of the things that I like about the work that you've done over the years, Nick, is that you come at this fairly objectively. I don't find that you have an axe to grind or a particular point to make, but that you really do come at your research from a pretty incisive aspect. I wouldn't call you a skeptic, except maybe in the healthiest sense, and you're certainly not a debunker, but you don't seem to embrace the easy arguments on a lot of things. Does that come from a place of objective journalism, or simply your own sense of discovery?
Well, I think it's a bit of both, actually. I mean, I'm not the sort of person who, if I don't have proof, I'm not going to, bang on the table and say, you must believe this theory, because at the end of the day, if it's just a theory, it's just a theory. What I do is, if I'm investigating one particular angle, let's say we're talking about Bigfoot, and I will say, well, Bigfoot's been seen in this particular area for decades, and yet when you go out there and you check the available food supply, it's actually very low in nourishment, and there's not much there. So how does a 400-pound animal sustain itself on a daily basis? I would use that as an argument to say that's one of the reasons why I think Bigfoot is more paranormal or only fragmentarily here in our time. But I can't prove that, so I'm not going to sort of hammer down on the table and say this proves it. I would say this is suggestive, in my view, that we need to broaden our approach. But, when people start saying, this is what's going on and this is why the aliens are visiting, then I'm not saying that, they're not earnest and, of a good mind or whatever, but when people claim to know with 100% certainty what's going on, I think they've crossed over from being objective to being just totally belief-driven. Mm-hmm. And there's nothing wrong with believing in things, providing we understand the difference between having a belief and having proof to support that belief. And that's why I try to get all the information across to people, but I don't feel the need to try and convince someone that the theory is correct. I prefer to give them the data to allow them to make their own minds up, because I truthfully don't have the answer. I have a lot of data that's suggestive of this or that, but, unless we're really lucky, all of us, whether people admit it or not, we're all still in the dark to a significant degree and scrambling for answers. And I think it's important to stress that. There's nothing worse than telling somebody you're right when at the end of the day you're not really able to prove it. And that's not like a weakness of character. It's not denying anything. It's just a fact of reality that if we don't have all the answers, it's reckless of us to claim that we do have all the answers just because it's a belief,
Well, I certainly think that anybody that goes through your books will get the sense that there is objective research going on out there. We're winding down. Gosh, this went by so fast, Nick. 90 minutes seemed like a lot when we started, and here we are.
That's missing time.
Yeah, there you go. Give out your websites, anything that you want for contact information, and your books, where people can find you.
Okay, well, people can contact me at Nick Redfern 14, which is Fortean, Nick Redfern 14.blogspot.com, or I'm on Facebook, on Twitter. Always pleased to chat with people, answer questions. Anybody's got any cases they want to share with me with a view to getting answers, always pleased to help. I'm not one of these sort of ego-driven authors who won't talk to people. I view us all as on the same level. We've all got our own input. We've got the witnesses, you've got your radio show, I do books. We're all hopefully can come together and share the data and, get a bigger picture of what's going on. So always pleased to chat with people. People can get the books, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, all good online places. As far as upcoming events are concerned, I'm speaking on this book, The World's Weirdest Places, in Austin, Texas, this Saturday night. If anybody who's in the Austin, Texas area, it's at a place called the Austin Center for Spiritual Living. I forget the road that it's on, but if you Google it, you'll find it. Then on the weekend of the 19th of this month, I'm speaking at the Paradigm Symposium in Minneapolis, and be a lot of well-known authors there, including actually Eric von Daniken.
Oh, wow. That's
a rare appearance, I think, for him in the US. So I'm looking forward to that one. That's like a 4-day event, so that should be a good one. And, always, as I said, I'm always around to sort of hopefully answer questions and sort of come up with a new idea for another book, hopefully. So.
Well, we'll get you back again soon, Nick, because it's fun. It was way too long the last time, and you are definitely one of my favorite guests. Nick Redfern, the book is The World's Weirdest Places, and go to Amazon if you can't find it anywhere else. We have information posted on both of our websites as well, with links and contact information. Nick Redfern, thanks for coming on Off Planet Radio, my friend. Good to talk to you.
Thanks, Randy. Thanks a lot.